Okay, so this morning we focused on a little bit of how to find money, whether it was project financing or equity that Hamada talked to us about. And we, this afternoon, are going to get a little more specific. We're going to get down to buildings, and we're going to get down to specific topics like electrification. And so our first conversation this afternoon is going to focus a little more narrowly on the issue of electrification and multifamily. And just to provide a little bit of context, many of you who have interacted with institutional investors today, they are asking for that. Essentially, we are on a trajectory where every asset, new and existing, is going to need a decarbonization plan. That decarbonization plan, you might know it as CREM, you might think of it as Local Law 97, you might think of it as a lot of things. But one way or the other, we are on our way to the kind of ubiquity about decarbonization planning, which effectively is capital planning. So whether it's a new building or an existing building, it's gonna have a plan. That plan is gonna have electrification as the heart of it, because we don't get to zero carbon buildings without essentially electrifying most of what we do in buildings today. So with that said, we're gonna dive in the details and learn about some of that experience from New York City. Who's starting? All right.
Great, thanks for the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. Really pleased to be here. This is a room that's about 4 times as big as I expected, but glad to be here at any rate. I'm Grayson Jordan. I'm an architect, principal architect, Paul Castrucci Architects. We're in New York City. We do deeply energy efficient buildings. A lot of it's affordable housing, and that's what we're gonna talk to you about today. I'm here joined by my colleague, Leopold, also of Paul Castrucci Architects. The very long title, I'll read it to you and then I'll summarize what we're actually talking about. So, towards affordable decarbonization, lowering utility costs in electrified multifamily buildings. Basically, in New York City, we are electrifying our buildings, specifically in this case, affordable housing buildings. We think it's gonna cost more to operate those buildings. That's a problem, especially for affordable housing. So we wanna understand the magnitude of that problem and also come up with strategies for counteracting that problem. Okay, before we jump in, just a note, this is basically about a year's worth of research funded by NYSERDA. Many of you probably know NYSERDA. It's New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. They provide technical assistance, publicly available research, and funding and grants for the kind of work that we're doing. In this case, this is a Buildings of Excellence award-winning research. So they gave us a grant essentially to study this problem, which is common in New York City and also I think most of the East Coast. I don't know if I'm supposed to read these, I'll do it quickly. Learning objectives explain how energy generation, rate structure, and building management systems can work with Passive House, principles to lower energy use and cost. And quickly before we move forward, is everyone here familiar with Passive House? Anybody not? Yeah, a lot of nodding heads. Okay, good. Second learning objective is to give examples of how shifting domestic hot water and other peak loads can help mitigate environmental justice issues. Third, understand how lowering utility cost of electrified buildings is critical to ensuring high performance features are included in projects. And fourth, to identify how resident engagement through resident orientation or third-party apps can be used to lower peak energy demand in buildings. Okay. Again, before we jump in, as I said, this is about a year's worth of research. There's a lot that's gone into it, and we produced a full report. We're not going to be able to get into all of that here today, but if you're interested, you can go to our website, castrucciarchitect.com/insights. There's also a QR code. You can download it. I would encourage you to do that. You can follow along here if you'd like, but it's meant to be a free resource for you and your colleagues. There's also there's a tear sheet that's a 2-page summary of what we're talking about today. It's great for clients to give them the sort of 5 to 10 minute overview. Okay. Oh, too far. All right. I said what we're talking about. We're talking about lowering utility costs in fully electric buildings. And now I'm going to give you a little overview about why we care about it. So we're a full service, we do a lot of architecture, a lot of different typologies. We're also a sustainability consulting firm. A lot of what we do is affordable housing, and a lot of it's in and around New York City. We're working on tight budgets and tight schedules. And we're always trying to get as much as we can into these buildings from a design perspective. We want beautiful spaces for people to live. but we also want them to be deeply energy efficient. And we've traditionally done that through Passive House. And Passive House is a methodology that has a really good business case that we're able to take to our clients and take to the HPD, which is the regulatory authority for housing in New York City, and say, look, you might spend another 1 or 2% to get to Passive House here, but it's going to pay off. We can make a solid business case for that. And with that, we're going to get, of course, the energy efficiency gains, but also the lowered operating carbon, and also really importantly is the sort of health and comfort benefits that come with Passive House. And it's very important to us to preserve that business case so we can continue building these Passive House affordable housing buildings. Now, we're at a moment in time where full electrification of buildings in New York City is essentially mandated. So whether through Local Law 97 or Local Law 84, you're either from today required to do a fully electric building or highly incentivized to do it. And then affordable housing is HPD is essentially telling us that we need to do it. And we're supportive of it. New York State has committed to having a fully clean grid by 2040. And so once we get there, having all electric buildings is going to be really positive. In the short term, though, we are concerned about the increased cost to operate these buildings. Another big picture slide, I think we all know, buildings use a lot of energy. Residential buildings also use a lot of energy. Let's get to why we're concerned. The big picture takeaway is something that we call the utility gap penalty. These are New York City rates. Gas is a lot cheaper than electric. And so simply switching the same building from gas to electric, you're going to pay a 4 to 5 times penalty for that. And so when you think about affordable housing and sustainability, we want that to be beautiful, deeply sustainable, but it has to be financially sustainable. We're not going to release affordable housing buildings into the world that are too expensive to operate. As I said, we've traditionally gotten at this problem through Passive House. Passive House allows us to drive down our energy use for heating and cooling by about 50%. We supplement that with heat pump technology. And between those two things, we're not only getting over that gap penalty, but actually improving on it and having lower cost buildings. The one thing we've always carved out is domestic hot water, because domestic hot water, we just don't have the same tools for driving down demand. We can use heat pumps, and that might be 3 times as efficient as gas, but it doesn't get us all the way there. And our sort of guess or our theory was that if and when we start to electrify these buildings fully, we're going to see a significant increase in cost, and it's going to affect our clients' bottom line and potentially affect their incentives to build a Passive House, which is what we don't want. One other note on this, especially for affordable housing, is that the utility cost is a higher percentage of the annual operating budget compared to market rates, about 2.5 times that of market rate, because first of all, affordable housing operating budgets tend to be smaller, and they're also taxed a little bit differently. So for every $1 more that we're spending on utility costs for affordable housing, it has a bigger impact. I'm going to talk about how we studied this, but before I do that, I want to talk about what we mean when we say utility cost. We're just talking about heating, cooling, plug loads, and domestic hot water. Nothing else, not internet, nothing like that. Okay, so to study this problem, we did a case study, and our case study is this building here. This is the Beacon. This is one of our projects. It's in East Harlem, New York. It's got 2 components. In the front, you'll see an adaptive reuse of a school building into a community center. That's been carved out of this study. We studied that separately for embodied carbon, but it was not useful in our search to understand the cost of electrifying affordable housing buildings. So we just focused on that building behind, which is a 282 unit new construction affordable housing building. It's going to be FIAS Core certified, and is a really good example of a sort of a size, a scale, and a typology that we see over and over in New York and the region. And so we first established a baseline. We modeled using Wolfie Passive this building as if it were built to the current energy code, but fully electric. Then we did our second benchmark, which is the way we traditionally build this building, which is Passive House, but with gas domestic hot water, just to see what would we normally expect to spend before we electrify. And then we did a number of strategies, which Anna will go over with you here shortly, about how can we begin to peel away or eat away at this added cost. and reduce the operating costs, ranging from things that we do already and we're quite comfortable with, to things that are a little bit more forward-thinking and have less test studies. So as I said, we used WFI Passive to model this. We also used eQuest modeling to get hourly rates. We got solar performance from a consultant, geothermal performance from our consultant, and also building controls modeling from a consultant. So that's sort of setting us up on how we did this study, and I'm going to turn it over now to Anna to talk about the results.
Great, thank you, Grayson. I'm Anna Leopold. I'm a designer and energy analyst at Castrucci Architects with Grayson. On the screen here, you can see the different scopes that we looked at for our study using the beacon as a case study. On the left of the screen, you can see this code compliant baseline, which is fully electric, but only to code minimums. And then on the right, you have the utility cost reduction strategies that we looked at. So we have passive house or envelope strategies in green, renewable energy strategies in orange, and energy control and building management systems in blue. And we looked at all of these different scopes in terms of energy, carbon, and utility cost. We're only going to focus on the utility cost today, but you can find additional information on those other aspects in the report. We looked at most of these scopes in relation to each other using this sort of bar graph format to see the comparison. So a little bit of wayfinding. You can see each of the different scopes on the x-axis at the bottom of the screen, and then the annual utility cost is on the y-axis, which is the value at the top of each bar. Here on the screen, you can see this electric code compliant baseline. What's important to understand here is, first off, the cost of a code minimum fully electrified building is much higher than every other scope that we're going to look at today. Not only does this lock the building into really high utility costs, which is a burden to both building managers and often gets transferred to residents, but it also puts a sort of permanent strain on the grid by having high energy loads, which is not something building managers or the electric grid as a whole can really prefers. The other critical thing about high energy load electrified building is the fact that even though it's electrified, and that's really critical to getting to decarbonization goals, the reality of our electricity grid right now is that we still use fossil fuels to form electricity. And while we have goals to have fully renewable electricity, we're not there yet. In addition, what happens now at high peak energy events, think of when it's really hot in the middle of the summer and everyone has their AC on, the energy loads for the whole grid are really high, often higher than the usual energy plants can produce. So providers for energy like Con Ed in New York and other utility providers across the country rely on these peaker plants, which are essentially fossil fuel powered power plants that not only emit a large amount of carbon, but also pollutants. And unsurprisingly, they're often located in communities of color and low-income communities. So not only is this really critical for building financing and lowering our environmental impact, but this is also an environmental justice concern. So the next threshold or the next point of comparison that we looked at is this passive house plus gas. So this is basically the industry standard that Grayson was talking about, where most of the building is electrified except for domestic hot water. To date, this is really the most cost-effective way that we've found to do mostly electrified passive house multifamily buildings. And you can see that there's a significant drop in utility costs from this, about $520,000 a year to under $300,000. While this is our most cost-effective way to date, as Grayson said, in the future, not only is this not preferred because it locks in fossil fuels, but it's increasingly going to not be possible because of increasing electrification laws. So the real point of comparison we're going to be looking at throughout this presentation is the black dashed horizontal line across the screen. And that represents trying to overcome the utility gap penalty. So each strategy should get as close to that line as possible or beneath it. We can see that when we switch to passive house, fully electric, so gas has switched from domestic hot water has switched from a gas boiler to an electric heat pump, we see that the utility cost does go up. It is meaningful, but it's still significantly cheaper than a code minimum building. But this jump from around $295,000 to about $355,000 is an illustration of the utility gap penalty that we're trying to overcome. In practice, we find that full passive house certification, a fully passive house scope, just isn't always possible specifically for affordable housing, which is where we primarily practice. But what we have found is that designing to passive house principles gets us 80% of the way there. It won't be fully certified, but we see only a marginal increase in utility costs. But this scope does provide significant capital savings at the onset of the project. So we're seeing something around a little under $20,000 per year more expensive, but for the beacon, this looks like a $2 million savings in upfront costs. So the strategies I just spoke about are mainly envelope strategies that have to do with passive house. So first we wanna decrease energy loads using envelope strategies. Next, we want to decrease reliance on the grid, and we're shifting over to renewables. So solar, I think we're all pretty familiar with solar here, but this is an illustration of how solar can affect utility costs, but also our peak demand. So this is a heat map that shows the energy load for every hour of every day of the year. So you can see every hour at the top of the screen going from left to right, and then every day of the year separated by months as you go from the top to the bottom. And what you can see here is that the green color is low energy load, closer to red is high energy load, and then these points of blue are the point when there's no energy load, meaning that solar overcomes all of the energy demand of the building. And what we see is that in the middle of the day, specifically in the summer, that's when the graph starts to heat up, and that's meaning a lot of energy is being used. Fortunately, solar has the highest production at those same times, and you can see on the right that in the middle of the day throughout the year, the color starts to cool down, reaching actually blue throughout the spring. That translates to significant savings in utility costs. So solar alone can overcome a significant portion of that utility gap penalty. You can see the $295,000, that dashed horizontal line. And then when we include solar into the passive house scope, we're looking at something around $306,000. So solar is not only incredibly effective, but it's also tried and true, market ready, demonstrated, and really versatile in urban environments. One concept related to renewables that we came across in our research is voltage power management. So while renewables increased resilience and reliability in the grid as a whole, it does mean that potentially the voltage of that grid is going to be more variable, which poses a potential issue for high performance buildings, which have highly calibrated specialized equipment. So this concept of voltage power management is basically a step in between the grid and your building that would stabilize the voltage, creating safer voltage for the equipment that is installed into the building. The next renewable we looked at is geothermal, which so far and in our report as a whole, we see as one of the most effective strategies at overcoming and actually surpassing the utility gap penalty. So in other words, a passive house building with geothermal renewable is actually cheaper in terms of utility costs than our industry standard gas hybrid building. Before solar, we see that that's close to 7% savings. And when we add solar, we see even further savings. For the beacon, which is the project we're reviewing here, we found that by the time we were looking at it at design documentation, it was a little too late to be assessing the feasibility and implementation. So the lesson learned here is that implementing geothermal is possible and has a high payoff, but it needs to be done as early as possible. One renewable that isn't fully included in the report is wastewater heat recovery. This is a technology similar to an ERV for ventilation, which takes the excess heat from wastewater and uses it to heat domestic hot water, which is really promising for overcoming the utility gap penalty because it addresses specifically domestic hot water. This is totally sanitary and also has a lot of promise for being able to be installed in already existing buildings. This is already starting to be demonstrated in New York, and we're looking to install it in future projects. So after we decrease energy loads using envelope strategies and we decrease reliance on the grid, we move on to the loads of the building that aren't really affected by what we can do as architects, what we can do with the envelope. And these have to do with when energy is used and the loads like domestic hot water, who's gonna take a super long shower at the end of the day, or plug loads, you know, if you leave your computer charging or phone charging, etc. So we're looking at what strategies do we have to control when energy is used and how much it costs. So the first thing we looked at was time of use rates. This is an option provided by Con Edison in New York, and other utility providers across the country have similar programs. And essentially it incentivizes off-peak usage by charging very little at off-peak times in the morning and charging much more at peak or super peak times in the middle of the day. What we found is that when there's no actual mechanism to ensure when this energy is used, it actually increased utility costs. We do see that the solar savings multiply because there's solar being produced at the time when energy is the most expensive, but it's still not enough to even perform better than a passive house plus solar scope. So then we said, well, what are the controls we can combine with time of use rates to make sure the energy is used at different times and actually realize these savings? So that's where we turned to building management system controls. We looked at an array. We have fault diagnostics, peak demand, hot water controls, and demand response, which we'll go into a little more in depth. But these show a lot of promise for being able to be the mechanism to realize the incentives of time of use rates. We looked at these combined, but we have found that in implementation, it's probably going to be a little bit more of a specific bundle based on each project-dependent constraints, budget constraints, management goals, and systems included in the building. Well, first we'll start with fault diagnostics, which isn't really charted here. It's a little bit hard to chart, but this is basically a feedback loop that allows building managers to know, for example, if the heat's on in the summer, we're wasting energy and utility costs, which happens fairly frequently when there's no feedback loop to building managers. And then the next really control system that we looked at was peak demand. So this is a set of controls that are more focused on the house meter, the loads that the building managers are going to be paying for. And these are largely automated. So it's things like automated lights dimming based on occupancy, or fan speeds for ventilation systems going into essentially a low power mode when they're not needed. And it's a sort of a bundle of different things that can be automated into the building and show serious potential to almost entirely overcome the utility gap penalty. We see $295 to just about $305,000 a year. When we add in the multiplied savings from solar and time of use, we see a significantly less expensive building than the passive house gas scope. The next set of controls that we looked at is hot water control. So this is a singular approach which essentially drives exactly at the end use that is driving the utility gap penalty, which is domestic hot water, and something we traditionally have not been able to control. And the concept behind it is it pushes the energy use that would be used to heat the water at peak times to off-peak times by preheating it in the early hours of the day. And then the energy used to get it up to the temperature it needs to be is much smaller. And we see that this is actually really impactful for overcoming the utility gap penalty It addresses almost 80% of that increased cost of a fully electric passive house building. And with solar, it can drive it beneath that threshold. The last set of controls we looked at were demand response. So these are focused more on the tenant loads and have a little bit more flexibility for an opt-in, opt-out option. So these show more modest savings than the other two, but also could potentially have a lower buy-in cost. And one type of these controls that we really want to bring attention to are resident incentive apps. So this is really promising. We see as very promising because it's direct from the utility provider to the resident. And how this works is the residents would have an app on their smartphone, and the utility company would be able to directly speak to them and say, we have a peak event coming up. We will literally pay you to turn off your lights or unplug your chargers, turn down your AC, etc. And then the resident actually gets monetary incentives directly to them. So that way it takes a little bit of the load off of the building managers, but it also is a way to enact these demand response controls without any real hard cost investment. We also looked at all these different controls combined. So what we see in the study is that with the passive house, combined with the time of use rates and all of these building management systems together, we can effectively overcome the utility gap penalty. Once we include renewables in that with solar, we're seeing a 25% reduction in utility costs from this passive house plus gas threshold, which is really promising. As we're starting to implement this at the Beacon, we're seeing that it's not exactly possible for us to include all of these together. And it really comes down to what are the goals of the building managers, the building owners. Is it low investment and we're looking at something like fault diagnostics and incentive apps, or is it singular and high impact like simply the domestic hot water controls? So at this stage, it's looking at some kind of savings in this gray area. So for the Beacon specifically, we're finding that passive house and solar is tried and true, demonstrated, ready, and almost entirely effective at overcoming the utility gap penalty. That's the column in green. We also see that geothermal would have been incredibly promising to overcome this and actually make the building cheaper than a gas hybrid, but we weren't able to implement due to the phase of the project we were in. And we're currently looking at how time of use rates and building management systems can be integrated into the building to realize savings in construction documentation, which is where we're at now. So in terms of implementation, what we did at the Beacon and what we're taking into our practice moving forward is first, how can we decrease energy loads using envelope controls? So this is important to decrease energy loads from the beginning, as well as right size all of the MEP equipment you're investing in. Next is looking how can we decrease reliance on the grid using renewables. And then after those two, how can we then turn to potential tools to address the end uses like that are based on resident behavior like domestic hot water and plug loads by addressing when energy is used and how much it costs. So what we found from this study is that some of these strategies are tried and true, market ready, demonstrated. We know how to implement them like solar and passive house. Others have a really high payback, like geothermal, but they take a little bit more care for implementing them into our building. And then lastly, we have strategies like rate structure and controls, which are really promising, and we need to see them demonstrated, but at this point, it's gonna take a little bit more close collaboration between the building managers, the design professionals, engineers, and solution providers. But we're eager to see how these rate structures and controls start to be implemented across different types of buildings. We start to get data back and understand exactly how we can harness these tools.
Thanks. Just a few more notes before we wrap up, and then we'll turn it over to questions. I know we did it's a bit of a technical deep dive. We're technical people. We like that kind of stuff, but I think we can put this also in context. I first want to say we're very pro electrification. I don't know if that came across, but we need to electrify. When the grid is clean, it's going to be a really powerful tool. But in the short term, it's going to be a little bumpy. And I think we need to recognize that for us and for our clients, there's going to be cost and other implications. We got to get the grid robust enough, and we got to get it clean. And in the interim, there's going to be some cost implications that we have just to be clear-eyed about. First, looking, we can't just do electric buildings, especially in multifamily. It's going to be costly. It's 45% more than our gas plus passive house. And then the second biggest takeaway, I think, is that just moving the gas hot water to electric hot water is itself a 20% increase. And that's not the absolute end of the world, but that's significant and for any client, and especially for affordable housing. And so, for us as architects, our role is really trying to dig a little deeper, work within these renewable strategies that we're aware of, make them, fine-tune them, make them a little better, make sure we get them in all projects. And also as an industry, moving forward these sort of ideas of getting building controls and time of use rates into our buildings. I think it's really promising. There's a lot of value there, but we do need some test cases and demonstration projects, and we hope to have some of those, and we hope to see some of our colleagues out here today build some of those as well, so we can learn from you. So I think that's about sums us up. Thank you for your time. We really appreciate it, and I'm happy to turn it over to questions. Thanks.
Hello, thank you, Alicia Silva from Mexico. So one question, why are you not considering solar water heaters? Is there a prohibition or something? Because in Mexico, it would be like the least expensive, cost reduction, and then, solar for electricity and things like that. So it's just like, yeah, I saw this, and because water heating was such a big thing. I mean, when we turn on the water heaters, it's just like electricity can just like blow almost. But the water heaters have been a great tool. So I was very intrigued. Why didn't you put that as an option? Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you for your question. I think part of it is we're interested in installing solar as sort of a solution for a system-wide, building-wide benefit, renewable for the whole building. So instead of having a separate solar array that would be connected only to domestic hot water, we want solar that can affect loads throughout the building. And I think what we found is when we saw the passive house case and the cost drop when solar was applied, that 80%, 85% savings is really addressing just the domestic hot water load. And there's ways with building controls that you can determine what end uses the solar energy goes to first. So there is an option that the solar energy generated can go first to the house loads, like domestic hot water, and then whatever is left over could go to heating, cooling, plug loads, etc. But I think it's important to have the flexibility, but understand that the increased cost you really have to address is the domestic hot water. Does that answer? Oh, I see what you're saying.
Did you use the scale? Yeah. I haven't seen that a lot at this scale. I mean, I think if we back up a few slides, I can. Yeah. So if we go back to here, what you're seeing is, if you look at those blue graphs, see how the yellow is bigger than it is on the other ones? And the reason is there's this interactivity between solar, which is just running the meter backwards for electric, and it gives us, especially when we're using it with controls, this ability to we're moving power, but also combining that. We're sort of I'm not saying this well, but we're like multiplying the effect of the solar, which we're able to do because it's electric. I'm not sure that we'd be able to do that with solar hot water. Maybe we could, but we didn't study it for this one. Sorry. Yeah.
Hey, you guys. Tim Kohut, National Community Renaissance. I want to talk shop with you guys afterwards. We build zero net energy all electric buildings in California, so I want to trade notes with you guys. Great presentation. First thing, I have 3 questions, but I do want to talk about that. Solar heat pump water heaters hate hot water. So they work at the highest efficiency when the incoming water's 55 degrees. The COP tends to go down if you add solar thermal into it. And this is what we learned in California. It might work for you guys in the East where you have 2 different distribution systems that are kind of mixing together. But onward to my 3 questions. Can you guys first, what type of heat pump hot water heating system did you use? Do you know the manufacturer of it? Because you said it was more expensive. We've got solutions in California that are cost neutral with natural gas boilers.
I don't know if it was chosen here, but on the previous project was LG. And so I'm not sure that it's much more expensive to install it. It just costs more to operate it.
Got it. Your first costs are equal to a natural gas install.
It's a little bit more expensive, but
Okay.
I don't, that's not the driving force of the selection. We're definitely doing heat pump hot water heaters. There's like, when we're electrifying hot water, it's gotta be heat pump.
Great. We like Sanco in California, the West Coast, really affordable and versatile. Second question, how much of your building is offset? I'm assuming the PV's on the roof. How much of the total loads are offset by the PV systems in your buildings? Because you guys have much taller buildings than we have.
I don't have that number in front of me, but what you can do, it's probably about 15%.
Yeah, I'm guessing it's 20, maybe 15 to 20% of your total, because you taller buildings, it's harder to do it. Last question is, have you guys, the BMS is a great idea. We're also looking at stuff like that, even at unit level. We're doing it especially for housing that we're building for the formerly homeless. We've got ideas there, but have you guys thought about who operates and maintains the BMS system?
Yeah, I think that's sort of an open question that it takes collaboration with the building owners and the building managers too, because for some of these sort of low-hanging fruit for BMS, there's sort of like a limited interface for how you could control the different end uses like domestic hot water, or understand if there's an override on, and that's a pretty clear feedback loop. As we get into more advanced BMS, it does open up a question of, is there training that needs to happen for the building managers? Do the developers need to have some sort of training program in place for the superintendent or whoever is going to be managing the systems? But what we're starting to see is that there would really be more of like a station in the building that ideally all of the information comes into one place, and you get the feedback on how the building is doing, and as well that is sort of the place that you can start to control those things. But that's sort of an open question as we're implementing it on the beacon. As we start to look at what controls are we actually going to include, is what's the impact going to be for if people can actually use them, and what the developer is willing to invest and add to their already probably pretty high management load.
That's great.
Is there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, you nailed it at the end. It's like, it's a barrier. It's like, especially in affordable housing clientele, like any additional maintenance is a problem. And it's when we first broached this conversation with this client, that's the first question, first question is how much it's going to cost. And then it's like, well, how much more training and work is for my maintenance staff? And so it's really kind of up to us to figure out a way around it. The couple of ways we figured is New York State does have incentives for having people on staff who just do this. And so that's like kind of a stopgap short term, but then you can build up some of that expertise and it becomes sort of part of the profession. And the second is just some of the lower hanging fruit, like those resident incentive apps seems like super promising because it's almost no lift for the client, which they like.
That's great. Thanks, you guys.
Yeah, thanks.
Hi, Mark Mondor with Evolve. Two questions. First one is that we've had trouble knowing what the utilization has been for certain multifamily projects based on privacy concerns. I was wondering if there are any ways around that, or if anyone else has the similar problems understanding usage.
Understanding usage patterns of residents.
I know, just understanding actual usage.
Yeah. At a unit level, we don't have it. What we have is from collectively as a team between our development team, the architect, and our energy consultants as well, experience over the building overall that's applied to other sort of reference standards. Yeah, it's hard. Go ahead.
I think I would add, and very curious if anyone else in the room has had more experience with this, but we're starting to see that too, where we want the feedback loop of how are the buildings that we're building actually performing. And one of the things we're seeing in New York is there is benchmarking laws, and so some of that information we can find is publicly accessible, but it is something we're starting to think about is how can we ensure we're getting yearly data? Because we don't have it on a unit by unit case.
Okay, thanks. My second question, the column on the left is, baseline, which is, conventional default almost, but the same thing goes with first costs. So I was wondering if your studies show the additional first cost for these different technologies, if you have something like that per square foot, and then secondly, what would an ROI look like for these different strategies?
That one. We were able to get first cost for some of the strategies, but not all of them. And so in the report, we did not do an ROI, but we do have amongst these anecdotal and experience understating. So, and also we have specific data for the passive house to high performance. We knew that was about like a $1.9 million difference because we had cost estimates showing the difference. So no, we don't have ROI. We did want to have it, but we do not have it.
So thank you, Mark, for asking the ROI question. I was going to ask that. So Hamuda Youssef, this is so long. So a couple of questions. First, was the building certified as a passive house or just following the passive house guidelines?
It's in construction documentation now, but we're pursuing passive house certification via
Okay.
SCORE.
That's great. So the second one, looking at the efficiency gains between a passive house plus gas, and then the end of the scale, the other one was passive house plus BMS and everything, they look close to each other from the operational gains. Do you have the carbon impact or carbon saved? Because I bet it will taint a different color, that it will show, more reduction in, I don't know, I'm just guessing. But do you have figures on the impact, the carbon impact?
Yeah, so that's something we looked at too, and in the report on our website, each of these scopes, we have 3 of these graphs. One's carbon, one's energy, and one's utility cost. So it's the sort of thing where even just going from passive house gas to a fully electric passive house building, here the cost is going up, but the carbon is going way down.
Way down.
So it is something we're starting to look at, but I think what's interesting is for most of the BMS strategies, the overall energy load and carbon, it's roughly similar to the passive house scope. It's really changing, when the energy is used. There are some modest savings, but it's really about when and what the cost is associated with it.
So on that regard, when it comes to resiliency, we had a workshop last week with the City of Toronto speaking to condo owners and to electrification. And I'm echoing some of the questions I got from the audience in there. So first, gas is cheaper as a rate, as unit rate, than electricity, especially at the peak demand. So, and I think your graph showing that, it's more or less, that's why the gas option seems to be more efficient financially. Do you need to rely on the utility provider to bring the rates down, or there are other ways to use that cheaper energy when needed in your solutions? So that's one. And I will follow up on that from a resiliency perspective. For a full electric building, what kind of backup energy in case of a full blackout? Is it storage, energy storage, or gas transformer? So what's your, because there are costs associated with that. So looking at this would be great. Thank you.
I'm going to answer the second question first, and then I'm going to ask you to clarify the first question because I don't think I understood the intent. So for backup power, it's still gas. It's an emergency gas generator. One of the things we studied, we didn't talk about today, one of the things we did look at was solar battery backup. It's just very, very hard to do in New York City, and it's one of the recommendations that are coming out of the report is let's streamline getting these things approved. There are real concerns, I think, about that the FDNY has, but it's currently, as it's regulated, it's very hard to nearly impossible to get solar batteries into this building specifically. So yes, we want to get there. No, we're not there yet. So first question, if you could repeat or maybe rephrase.
First question, mostly into looking at the utility rates between gas and electricity and how people can be smart in using electricity when it's cheaper as a building scale. So from heating water and other use cases, and instead of just relying on gas because it's cheaper. So it's part of the barriers that people for moving for full electrification, that the unit rates are expensive. So if you have, gone through that.
Not just rates, right? I'm gonna, I think what I'm understanding you're asking is setting aside using utility rates to reduce cost, how do we reduce energy use and cost in hot water outside of utility rates? I mean, baked into all these solutions, starting with passive house gas, is a heat pump hot water heater. And I think that setting aside the solar hot water, which we didn't study here, for what we have been using, that's a very effective way to reduce cost. And a lot of that cost from the 524 to the 295, or not a lot, a good chunk of that is using heat pump technology for heating, cooling, and hot water. I think that's the biggest one. And then the second one is getting at the usage and how people behave. And that's something that's kind of flummoxed us since we've been practicing. But again, I think things like having residents take part in savings is a really strong strategy. So those resident incentive apps is a promising way forward.
And the other thing I would add to that is, you know, there's some strategies that are baked into other certifications that projects have to get. So we do a lot of enterprise green communities certifications in our office, and part of that, you know, you have to have low flow fixtures, and that's something that is going to just decrease the amount of hot water that's produced. And then other things for like plug loads, it's difficult. Like you have outlets, everyone has like extension cord and a million things plugged in. But one of the things we're starting to look at as an option that we got from one of our European colleagues is like an all on off switch. So this is something that would be baked into all the hardwired lights. So when you leave the house, you can just hit one switch, they're all gonna go off, and then you don't have lights that are on all day when you're at work, sort of thing. But yeah, I think Grayson said it, it's sort of, we don't have full control over that. Sort of.
We can talk about the shark again one more time. That's also really good. And the last thing is the shark. Anna talked about a little bit, like these waste heat, what do you call it? It's like energy recovery, waste heat. Yeah, heat recovery, hot water heating is very promising and easy to implement, which is key.
Good afternoon. I'm going to just kind of do a quick caveat on that on-off switch before I give my question. There is also a security aspect into that, is walking into a completely dark building and having to search for a light switch. That can be a potential security issue. My question for you, this project, I believe you said, is currently in design phase, construction phase?
Construction documentation.
Documentation phase, okay. You mentioned solar quite a bit. Have you gone through the Inflation Reduction Act and the Renewable Energy Act to determine about usage of grant funding to reduce the cost of that initial build out? I know that's a lot of concern for building owners as it is they push off on doing renewable energy because that initial upfront cost, they don't seem to understand the projection of it may cost more now, but over the length of your building's life, it will actually reduce your cost.
In New York City, we're lucky. We have a very educated clientele and robust solar consultancy network. And so that's sort of those incentives are baked in. We're aware of them. They're sort of laid out for us. And there's multiple options. So, I mean, I think one of the ways architects can help is like sometimes we'll come to a job and they'll say, oh, the solar is a 17-year payback. It doesn't make sense. We're not going to do it. But there are other options. You can lease it, and that can make sense. And part of our role is to coordinate and make sure we get as much solar for as inexpensively as we can on our roofs, but also to advocate for its inclusion in general. And then just speaking of the IRA, I mean, geothermal is one of the things that's heavily incentivized there. I'm unsure if that's politically secure at this moment, but it's something to keep an eye on. We're certainly keeping an eye on it.
Of course. And then my second question relates to focusing predominantly on solar. There are, I believe, some new products coming out of smaller building mountable wind turbines. I believe they're only about 2 feet in height. And whether or not that's been considered, especially in the northern regions, predominantly that don't get as much sunlight as, say, those that are closer to the equator. We live in a country that has a lot of different regions, a lot of different weather patterns, and with climate change, everything is changing. Just trying to see whether or not we are able to focus on all of the different options as a whole, as opposed to just focusing solely on solar. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for your questions. I can speak a little bit to the wind. We didn't really look at any on-site wind generation. I'm not super familiar with these like smaller ones. I think the context of this building is it's in a really dense neighborhood. We are touching buildings, ones already existing on the site that we're wrapping this high-rise building around it, and then we're adjacent adiabatic to a building next to us. And I think maybe this relates to the very first question, which there's like serious spatial constraints on the site. Thinking of the site plan, like there's nowhere on the site that any kind of wind could go that is not within like 30 feet of a window. You know, obviously there's not like the exhaust parameters that, you know, a gas-powered energy source would require, but that's sort of how tight it is. So in my mind, and maybe you think differently, but for most of the really like dense conditions that we're working in New York City, these like energy generation that take up a lot of space, like I don't know how feasible it is. If you've seen it done in urban environments, like we're looking to expand our toolkit and we'd be happy to learn.
I know, literally, I subscribe to several different sustainability publications, and this popped up.
Oh, okay.
I believe it is still undergoing review process.
Mm-hmm.
So it has been put out into production, but it's just something that popped into my head when we were talking about all the solar and the different options with geothermal and everything. I was like, okay, because having walked outside just recently, we do have a lovely wind tunnel effect outside.
Yes, yeah.
Especially in major cities with the taller buildings. So,
I think the one thing I would add there is that for this site, there's constraints, but we're seeing different kind of sites in the city, specifically like NYCHA packed New York City Housing Authority campus style plots, and this is the same, I think, kind of goes for other campus styles, potentially like campuses, like educational campuses, where there is more available ground that potentially solar hot water heaters, or if there's a wind option, or lend themselves really well to geothermal. That's not like something we have here, but for other types, yeah. Thank you.
Hello, Mike Mendoza with Code Green Solutions. Question, kind of two-part question. You spoke about it briefly on the low-flow fixtures. How much of a sensitivity analysis for that was in your model in the sense of peak load? Because, as you know, if you put in low-flow shower heads, over time, residents tend to take them out and put in higher flow shower heads. And if you're in a retrofit situation, which is more where I'm coming from, it's going to be a mix. So just wondering how that was factored into your load ranges. And then on the space constraints in a corollary, you can only preheat the water so much. Eventually you need a bigger tank, right? So if you don't have any more space to put in a bigger tank, you're going to be limited on the preheating of the hot water. So just curious how you're thinking about those two dimensions and how this approach may be applicable in a retrofit situation where there's space limited or you can't really ensure low flow fixtures.
Yeah, to the first question, so we modeled in Wolfie Passive, and we took the European assumptions and we threw them out, and we used what we have historically seen in buildings, which I forget the number. It might have been a little bit more than 1.5 that gallons per person per day or whatever. And it was not as granular as you're suggesting. It's more rule of thumb, what we've seen. We've been working in this typology since about 2012, so it's a decade's worth of experience. The second question, so on none of the blue things did we get into a design study on them, so we weren't setting aside tank space, but that kind of thing is noted sort of as things you need to consider is tank space, but also structurally, where are you putting these things if it's on the roof, reinforcing the roof. So something like that might be better for new construction than renovation. Same with solar batteries. Yeah, I don't know if that fully answers your question, but go ahead, Anna.
I would add that all of the parameters are in the report, and I know from doing the analysis, I think the standard Wolfie Passive water is around like 6.6 gallons per person per day, and we did some where we bumped it up to 12 gallons, doubling that, and we bumped it up to 20 gallons at different points. Because what we're seeing in New York is the set points people use are higher in the winter, cooler in the summer, and the water usage is just way higher. I want to say that in some of them we did use low flow fixtures because that was just a given we had to do. But I would say that for retrofits, basically a lot of these, there will be some additional cost, but the wastewater heat recovery is something that is sort of like a discrete piece of equipment that gets added if you do have the space. Instead of like reworking the entire domestic hot water system, we were looking at it at a different project as like a potential retrofit solution because there was room in the basement kind of thing. So that would be a recommendation there.
One more thing to add on that first point with, as you're talking, I'm thinking about it. If we're underestimating the amount of domestic hot water being used, then the problem we're highlighting here is actually worse, right? So I think historically we've been pretty close with some of whenever we've gotten data back, we don't have granular data, but we have big picture data on buildings, and they tend to be, within 5-10%. So I think we're somewhere in the ballpark. But as you say, if the hot water problem is, if we're using more hot water and hot water is more expensive, then the problem's worse, and we need to think even harder about it.
Hello, Justin Claffey, Simon Builders. Coming from the construction management side of things, recently, looking at this chart with geothermal, a lot of clients have been kind of requesting it. I'm based in Philadelphia, similar to New York. A lot of old buildings, a lot of existing buildings is where we do a lot of the work. Have you guys been able to install a geothermal system within an existing building? And if so, how? Or is it just new builds?
No, we haven't looked at it. We looked at it for
Yeah. We haven't done it yet. It's something that we keep looking at, and I think hope to do. We have had another set of buildings that we were doing sort of a decarbonization roadmap for, and these were existing buildings, and we worked with a couple different geothermal providers, and there is a technology to drill under existing buildings. Obviously, you have to look what's under there, but at an angle, and there is sometimes potential to go under sidewalks or setbacks. But part of it is, you know, even the head height of how to get the rig like in a basement. And then the other part of it is financing it, is some of the different geothermal providers we talked to, there's a range, either the developer can own it entirely, there's joint venture options, and then there's essentially the geothermal company would own and operate it, and you would get some kind of credits and a lower rate than you would with your utility provider. You know, a similar situation that you have to solar. So we haven't done it yet, but those are the ways we're looking at it.
And just where we're not looking at geothermal, that waste, I can't ever say it, the heat recovery wastewater is a good solution. It's a much smaller, easier to implement. And then also NYCHA buildings. So public housing is a good, they have campuses. It's a good fit for it.
One real quick. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, sorry, we're short on time here. So we work with a lot of multifamily developers that are just interested in ROI. And I'm curious to learn from you, what's your elevator pitch for convincing or bringing on board a developer into passive house or lower EUIs that they're just focused in the Midwest in ROI and don't necessarily grasp the concept?
Yeah, it depends on the developer and it depends on what their interests are. So if it's business only, what we'll say is, well, it also depends on the buildings, but we'll see, let's say 1 to 2% cost increase for something like passive house. And then we will do ROI studies on buildings. We didn't do it here, but we'll do it and show them. And then if it's in New York City, we'll overlay things like Local Law 97, which have cost implications beyond sort of your utility cost. And then often our clients have values aligned with ours. And so we'll make arguments about, you know, this will make it more appealing for funding. You can get these incentives out here. And then for the ones who are most aligned with us, we'll make the arguments about carbon and about the user experience, which is quite important to us, health and comfort.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I would also add that on the NYSERDA website, they have the Empire Building Challenge, which we've taken part on, not on this project, but all of those projects have had to do financial case studies and they're online, and that could be helpful.
Thank you.
Right. All right, so we have got about a 10, oh, thank you very much, first off. We've got about a 10 or 12 minute break and then come back and we're gonna have our final session of the day before the closing plenary. And so we're gonna talk about triple bottom line analysis and things like that. So come back in about 10 minutes, take a short break. Thanks.